In this video, we will be focusing on the origins and the history of pre-Islamic Arabia. So, what was Arabia like before Islam? And when we talk about Arabia, we're talking about essentially the modern-day Middle East. How does this history and how does this culture impact on the development of Islam? So, to outline the social conditions and religious practices that existed in pre-Islamic Arabia, which is .3.1.a, we have developed this mnemonic system to help you remember the information, which we call the 7 PMs.
The 7 PMs are the peninsular places with Mecca and Medina as our focus. Peoples, looking at migratory and nomadic clans. Professions, which are predominantly merchants and traders in pre-Islamic Arabia. We look at pluralism, how these cities had multiple faiths in Mecca and Medina. We look at prayerful pilgrims who had a monotheistic faith. We look at these prayerful groups such as the Hanifs as well. Then we look at the PRISM, which is a monolith. It is named the Kaaba, and the Kaaba is the most sacred place of worship for Muslims. And then finally, we see the Prophet Muhammad born into this world, pre-Islamic Arabia, and peace be upon him. Muslims use the phrase peace be upon him straight after and every time they say his name as a sign of their deep respect.
The first of the PMs is place. So we look at the peninsula and we look at major cities like Mecca and Medina. So Islam originated in the 7th century, which was approximately 1400 years ago, on this Arabian peninsula. And as you can see, a peninsula is a piece of land that's almost completely surrounded by water. And the places of Mecca and Medina are located in modern-day Saudi Arabia, which is the largest peninsula in the world. What were these places like? The majority of Saudi Arabia still is, and was, an arid desert region with very little fertile soil and lots of sandy dunes. However, there were these little pockets where cities existed and there was large activities going on in those cities, such as Mecca and Medina, which are very important to the life of Muhammad.
So Mecca is about 80 kilometers from the Red Sea and lies close to the Indian Ocean. Mecca was founded on the trade routes between coastal towns of the Indian Ocean and the thriving cities of Syria and Egypt. And Medina was only approximately 300 kilometers north of Mecca. These two cities are located on the map that we have here. You can see how trade becomes a very important part of pre-Islamic Arabia and the commerce and trade and economics, because Medina and Mecca are a direct link between Asia and Africa. So you can see that all these continents will influence these two cities in terms of commerce and trade.
The next PM is peoples, and we're looking at migratory peoples. So Arabs are said to be the descendants of Ishmael, and Ishmael is one of the sons of the Prophet Ibrahim, or in English, Abraham. The word Arab means nomad or migratory. So these people are moving around. So they have no settled land where they call home. They migrate around the peninsula. And in pre-Islamic Arabia, there was no unified government as well. So the peninsula was divided into tribes who held the power in particular areas for certain amounts of time.
A person's identity and security was based on the membership of one of these clan groups. Clan groups held power through scheming and warfare. There were blood feuds and vengeance between tribes. Brawling, gambling, drinking, and sexual promiscuity were widespread daily habits for many people. Because of all these different clan groups, and all these groups wanting to hold power and to protect their own, issues started to arise. Example, did you know that if someone in the clan was murdered, it was the responsibility of other clan members to avenge that death? So they had the right to kill other people that came into their clan and harmed or killed their own members.
And although it was uncommon amongst nomadic tribes, small trading hubs like Mecca and Medina began to develop. Women had quite a low status for the majority of pre-Islamic Arabia, although we know from Muhammad's life that his first wife, Khadija, she was a very wealthy businesswoman, so there were some women that were able to do business and engage in commerce. However, women were often seen as property. Female infanticide, which is where a young girl is born into the tribe and then killed, that was quite common, and so was polygamy. So men were allowed to have multiple wives, but women weren't allowed to have multiple husbands.
Third, professions and jobs. The most common were these three, so merchants, craftspeople, and shepherds. Merchants were those that serviced the well-established trade routes between Asia, Syria, and Egypt. So they would trade things between continents and places. Craftspeople were those people that created fine arts and homewares such as clothing, pottery, furniture, rugs. And third, shepherds, who were small, scattered tribes moving livestock between desert oases.
So the fourth PM is pluralism, which means that there were multiple faiths. The Arabian Peninsula was home to multiple religions. Christians and Jews were part of that, but were minority groups. And there were also many other polytheistic religions. One particular polytheistic religion was Zoroastrianism, which is a religion based on the idea of a good god and a bad god, or an evil god, I should say, that are constantly fighting. So when there's a good day, it's because the good god has the upper hand. Now, the majority of local religions were polytheistic. They often associated their religion with an element of nature. So things like stones, trees, water springs, they were all venerated for their mystical or sometimes magical properties. The Arabs in that area also believed that their world was haunted by jinn, or in its plural form, jinni, which we associate with genies, such as the genie from Aladdin. And these are spirits who were either really, really helpful people, or they were evil. They were benevolent. They only wanted bad things.
Religious groups had well-developed ritual practices that involved temples, priests, sacrifices, and so on. There was also a thriving industry in the manufacture and sale of idols and other images used in ritual practices of the religion. These idols were often made from wood, stone, or clay and sold for money. At the time of Muhammad, there were believed to be over 350 altars or shrines to local deities. A supreme god named Allah was worshipped by some Arabs in Mecca, but only as part of a polytheistic tradition. All these points here clearly gives us insight into how pluralistic pre-Islamic Arabia was.
The fifth PM is Prayerful Pilgrims. Pilgrimage, which is a journey, especially a long one, made to a sacred place as an act of religious devotion, was quite common before the time of Muhammad, and it is still quite common in Islam. Arabs would travel to sacred places to circumambulate, which means to walk around. They used to do this around megaliths or monoliths, which are large stones, like Uluru, for example, if they were to do that in our environment in Australia.
Hanifs were a religious movement or group that were one of the greatest prayerful pilgrims we can look at, that grew out of Abraham's monotheistic belief in one God of supreme power and authority, a creator God which existed separately from the rest of creation and had been revealed in the past through messengers such as Musa, Moses, and Isa, Jesus. You can see how these prayerful pilgrims, the Hanifs, are in stark contrast to the pluralistic society in the cities of Mecca and Medina. Now, they chose to be a monotheistic belief, honouring one God, in order to find that purity of heart and to strengthen that belief. They had to pray often. They had to live in solitude for long periods of time. They had to reflect and meditate, and they would usually do this in desert caves around Mecca, so outside of the cities, around the cities. And fourth, just reflecting on the idea that there is only one God, and that God is Allah.
The 6th PM is PRISM, which you can see here. We name that prism the Kaaba, which is a monolith. And it is the center of pilgrimage and worship in Mecca. It was said to be built by Ishmael and his father Ibrahim or Abraham. Firstly, Muslims believe that the sacred site was a place that was venerated by angels before the creation of humans. It was also a sacred site where Adam and Eve built a temple to God, but this temple was destroyed by the Great Flood. So you can see why the person of Ibrahim or Abraham is important, because he and his son rebuild this temple.
The most powerful tribe in Mecca were the Quraysh tribe. They engaged in commerce and had total control over the merchants in Mecca, and they held guardianship over the Kaaba. This enabled them to make enormous profits from the religious pilgrims coming into Mecca, as they held a monopoly on the local economy. What does it mean that they held a monopoly on the local economy? It means that they had exclusive possession and control of all the supplies and trade coming in and out of Mecca. Now, it is important to note that the Quraysh tribe was actually the tribe that Muhammad was born into. Later on, we'll see how this tribe plays a great part in his life.
It's also important to note that the Kaaba was originally built by Ibrahim to worship and praise a monotheistic God. However, by the time of Muhammad, it had become this center for idolistic worship. So there were many altars around Mecca, and people would associate their own personal God with this monotheistic monolith. And that involved a lot of money as well. So people were brought to Mecca to be able to worship there. And the Quraysh tribe obviously made a lot of money out of that situation. So the last PM is the Prophet Muhammad. Now, why is the Prophet Muhammad an important person to consider? Well, most importantly, Muhammad had an extraordinary experience, and he received an awe-inspiring revelation from the Archangel Jibril or Gabriel, where he received the Quran. So this makes Muhammad essentially the founder of Islam. He is the highest prophet of Islam. Other prophets such as Adam, Ibrahim, Moses, and even Jesus are highly regarded, but they aren't as highly regarded as Muhammad. His name means highly praised. And just a little bit about the life of Muhammad. He was born in 570 CE. He was born in Mecca, and he was a member of the Quraysh tribe. He was an orphan. His father died before he was born, and his mother died when he was 6. His grandfather and his uncle cared for him, and both had great influences on him as he grew up. His grandfather held monotheistic beliefs and was possibly a Hanif. And Muhammad lived with his grandfather until he was about 8. So he was also introduced to a life of monotheism. And as an adult, Muhammad would often meditate upon deeply religious matters in a cave outside the city, which is something that a Hanif traditionally would do. And it was obviously in one of these caves where Muhammad had his first revelation from Allah.
This is a table just to show what Muhammad is and what he is not. So he is the highest prophet. He's also the last and final authority of Allah's word to mankind. So that makes him the last prophet. He is the highest model of correct behavior in Muslim life. However, he is not divine, he is not a savior, and he is not a miracle worker. These characteristics are all due to Allah's greatness. So they don't worship Muhammad as sort of God. Allah is the only divine, the only savior, the only miracle worker in the Islamic faith.
Sometimes students ask, if Muhammad is the final authority on Allah's words, then why is there this need for the Islamic jurisprudence process or the development of jurisprudence? And it's a good question to ask, but really just to clarify that, it simply means that Muhammad was the final prophet. He's the last person to hear God's word here on earth, and there's really no need for another prophet to follow him. However, in modern times, as new ethical issues arise, there needs to be this clarification of how Muslims respond to those new ethical situations. So the Quran and the Hadith need to be interpreted to suit modern lifestyles, to suit modern technologies, and to suit modern issues, which is why this jurisprudence process is really important, and it doesn't, and most of the time it goes beyond the Quran and it leads to interpretations on the Quran. So you have now reached the end of syllabus dot point 3.1, which was to outline the social conditions in pre-Islamic Arabia, but we've already started to look at syllabus dot point 3.2, which is all about the life of the Prophet Muhammad. So who is Muhammad? What is a prophet? And what significant events in Muhammad's life led to the development of Islam? We'll be going through all of these things in our next video.
So stay tuned.